Welcome dear students. The topic of today's lecture is World War II, Causes and Consequences. Some of the important objectives of this lecture are to provide a comprehensive account of the World War II, to explain and analyze the causes of the war, to discuss the post-World War situation, and to explore the political, economic and social implications of the war and its aftermath, and finally to consider the lasting impact of the war on the world today. First, let's start with the introduction. The 20th century of the world history witnessed the bloodiest wars of human history in the form of World War I and II. Death and destruction which resulted because of these two wars is beyond any human imagination and quantification. Political scientists and scholars of international relations have put forward various theories and arguments vis-à-vis the factors and consequences of these devastating wars. However, there are no clear-cut answers to these questions. In this context, the current lecture is an attempt to understand and explain some of the major causes which led to World War II and give a systematic assessment of its consequences. The death and destruction of the World War I, also known as the Great War, was so horrible that it was called the war to end all wars. Yet, the agreement to end World War I did not resolve the world's problems. According to some historians, it led directly to World War II between 1939 to 1945 and would prove even more catastrophic for the entire world. Around 80 million military and civilians, including 6 million Jews, died as a result of this war. Besides the human misery, deprivation and suffering, the dislocation of the people and of economic life, or the sheer physical destruction of property that the war involved is beyond any real statistical measurement. Moreover, the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States of America caused leukemia, cancer, and other side effects from the radiation for generations to come in the targeted areas. The Second World War was the biggest and deadliest war in history, involving more than 30 major countries. The war had two military alliances against each other, Axis powers and Allied powers. The Axis powers include Italy, Germany, and Japan. The Allied powers, on the other hand, were England, France, Russia, and the United States of America. Nations with colonies required their colonies to provide resources and soldiers for the war effort. The Allied powers fought in Europe to prevent the spread of fascist regimes across Europe, especially Eastern Europe. Japan fought in Europe for the expansion of Japanese imperialism. America entered the war following Japan's attack on the American naval base in Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Sparked by the 1939 Nazi invasion of Poland, the war dragged on for 6 bloody years and ended with an Allied victory and the fall of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. Allied nations created new international order and institutions such as United Nations Organization, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to manage economic and political global relationships. Moreover, the war led to the spread of communism from the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, as well as its eventual triumph in China and the global shift in power from Europe to two rival superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, that would soon face off against each other in the Cold War. Now, let me discuss some of the important causes that led to the World War II. What precisely sparked the Second World War? Political scientists and historians agree that a multitude of factors contributed to its onset. These include the repercussions of the Treaty of Versailles following the World War I, the global economic downturn, the failure of appeasement, the emergence of militarism in Germany and Japan, and the ineffectiveness of the League of Nations. It's also widely believed that the Second World War was a direct consequence of the First Great War. Now, let me explore some of the generally accepted factors which led to the Second World War in more detailed manner. And I'll begin by talking about the failure of the Treaty of Versailles. Historians argue that the English and French used the Paris Peace Conference and the Versailles Treaty to punish the losing nations with severe consequences that crippled the losers' societies and prevented them from creating political and economic systems after the war. The treaty only blamed the losing side and did not require the French and British to consider what role they may have played in creating the conditions that led to the First World War. As a result, the losing nations, especially Germany, were humiliated and angry at their harsh treatment. Germany had to take full responsibility for the war and agreed to give up its colonies and portions of its territory in Europe. The treaty also forced Germany to give up territory to Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, and return Alsace and Lorraine to France. Through the treaty, Germany was asked to pay billions of dollars in financial reparations. Restitution destroyed the German economy and prevented the German government from having the money necessary to rebuild Germany and stabilize its economy. After the war, Germany suffered from high inflation that made many essential goods like bread and milk unaffordable for common people. Germany also had to reduce the size of its military. Along with setting restrictions, the treaty also restricted the German government from manufacturing submarines, tanks, warplanes, and poison gas. This treaty was signed by the post-war government known as the Weimar Republic. The German people resented the Weimar government for accepting this treaty, which contributed to the rise of the fascist Nazi party and Adolf Hitler. Now, coming to another important factor, which is economic downturn. The economic downturn can always be relied upon to create conditions of civil, political, and international unrest. Hyperinflation hit Germany hard in 1923-24 and facilitated the early development of Hitler's career. Economic depression in Germany after the World War I and the global Great Depression of 1929 led to declining living standards. As people's suffering increased within the industrial nations, political instability increased. Population became more open to radical leaders who blamed groups for economic conditions and offered radical changes to improve economic conditions. This openness to alternative voices gave extremists a microphone to preach fascist and authoritarian ideas that blames society's trouble on specific groups. Hitler was democratically elected and appointed leader of Germany in 1933. He rose to power using an openly anti-Jewish campaign that blamed Jews for Germany's economic troubles. Another important factor is the formation of fascist and authoritarian regimes and militarism. Fascist political leaders came to power in the 1920s and in 1930s in Italy, Germany, and Spain. Promoting the strength and glory of the state was of utmost importance in fascist systems. Fascist regimes violently repressed all political opposition. Fascist governments also banned all political opposition and eliminated speech and media freedoms. For example, Mussolini was Europe's first fascist dictator. He and his supporters took control of the Italian parliament in mid-1920s, riding on a wave of general social discontent, which included the belief that the great powers had disrespected Italy at the Paris Peace Conference, despite Italy being on the winning side. Adolf Hitler rose to power in the early 1930s in Germany. Like Mussolini, Hitler came to power promising to rebuild the glory of Germany from the embarrassment and unjust treatment of the Versailles Treaty. He came to power through legal democratic processes. However, he used his authority to overthrow the Germany's democracy and seize absolute power. Franco in Spain rose to power after the Spain fell into civil war in 1930s. When the war ended, fascist leader Francis Franco defeated the Republic of Spain. While Spain never officially entered World War II, Franco did provide some assistance to Mussolini and Hitler. Franco retained power in Spain until 1975. Rise of authoritarianism in Japan. The Meiji reforms of the late 19th century transformed Japan into a constitutional monarchy. While technically democratic, a small, powerful elite ruled Japan. As Japan became increasingly angry at the Western refusal to view them as an equal partner, Japanese nationalism surged. Conservative forces completely took over the government in the 1930s and adopted militaristic policies that viewed expansion as the best way to protect Japan. Authoritarian leaders silenced opposing voices. Moreover, these regimes in Europe and authoritarian leaders in Japan were militant nationalists. They glorified the military, combat, and dying for the nation. They devoted significant portions of their nation's gross domestic product to enlarging their armies and building modern weaponry and fighting forces. Subsequently, by mid-1930s, Hitler possessed one of the largest and strongest industrial militaries in the world. Now coming to the another significant factor, which is imperialism and colonial aspirations among the fascist regimes. One feature of World War II fascism was an obsession with expanding the state's territory and power, especially into the regions of those deemed inferior races. After becoming the leaders of Italy, Mussolini expanded the Italian Empire. Mussolini invaded and defeated Ethiopia. Mussolini combined this territory with pre-existing Italian colonies. In 1939, Italy invaded and annexed Albania into Italy. On the other hand, after assuming power, Hitler exploited the Treaty of Versailles and the dents in German pride and defeat in the war had created by instilling a renewed sense of extreme national pride. He sought to build a German empire close to home. He became obsessed with expanding German living space in Central and Eastern Europe. Hitler sought the permanent removal of Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Czechs, and other Slavic people from conquered lands. Germans and pure Aryans would settle conquered territories. In 1925, through the publication of Mein Kampf, Hitler had outlined an intention to unite Germans across Europe in a reconstituted territory that included Austria before securing vast tracts of land beyond this new reach that would ensure self-sufficiency. In 1938, Hitler annexed Czechoslovakian Sudetenland. England, France, and Italy approved this annexion of areas in Czechoslovakia where German speakers lived. In return, Germany agreed not to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia or any other country. However, in March 1939, Germany broke its promises and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. As a result of the invasion, Czechoslovakia split into two pieces. The western portion of Bohemia and Moravia were proclaimed as German protectorate and occupied by German forces. The eastern part of Czechoslovakia became independent and allied with Germany. Neither Britain nor France was prepared to take military action. On September 1, 1939, German troops invaded Poland. Britain and France immediately declared war on Germany. Thus, the Second World War had begun in Europe officially. Japan, on the other hand, kept expanding its empire. Throughout 1930s and early 1940s, Japan invaded European colonies throughout the Southeast Asia. The Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia and Myanmar were either attacked or occupied by Japan. Now, let me talk about the last important factor which led to the World War II, which is the failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an international organization set up in 1919 to keep world at peace. It was intended that all countries would be members and that if there were disputes between countries, they could be settled by negotiations rather than by force. The League of Nations was a good idea, but ultimately a failure. Not all countries joined the League, and the League had no army to prevent military aggression, such as Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in Africa or Japan's invasion of Manchuria in China. These were some of the important factors that led to the Second World War. Now, coming to the another section of this lecture, which is about the consequences of the war. With the conclusion of the Second World War, the Allies celebrated victory, but soon the costs of the war began to emerge. The war killed between 70 to 85 million people around the world. In Europe, over 30 million people had lost their lives, more than half of them civilians. The Soviet Union suffered the worst casualties, with more than 20 million dead. Germany, parts of Poland, the Soviet Union, Japan, China, and other countries lay in ruins. Total war had destroyed cities, factories, harbors, bridges, railroads, farms, and homes. Over 20 million refugees wandered Europe. Amid the devastation, hunger, disease, mental illness, and political instability took their toll for years after the fighting ended. Like after World War I, the Allies faced difficult decisions about the future. The end of Second World War was a time of transition. That war transformed global politics in a new direction. New players replaced the old ones in global politics. Some of these consequences were immediate and others had a long-term impact on regional and international politics. Now let me discuss some of the immediate and major consequences of the war. And I'll begin by talking about the end of totalitarianism and split of Germany. First of all, the end of World War II and the defeat of Axis powers brought an end to authoritarian and fascist regimes in Europe. Large European populations living under fear and suppression were liberated. At the Yalta Conference in 1944 and then at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, the Allied powers decided that Germany would be split into occupational zones, that there would be border adjustments, and that Germans living in Eastern Europe would be relocated to Germany proper. All of Germany east of the Old River was assigned to Poland as compensation for the territory that Poland gave to Soviets. Prussia, which had been the state that unified modern Germany and whose territory was now almost entirely given over to Poland, was dissolved by an order of the Allied powers in 1947. The three Allied zones in the West would eventually be consolidated to form West Germany, while the Soviet-controlled East Zone became East Germany. They would remain two separate countries until 1990. The another important consequence of the Second World War was the beginning of Cold War. The end of the World War in September 1945 marked the end of an international system centered on the European great powers. At the end of the World War II, Germany, Italy, and most of France lay in ruins while Great Britain was bankrupt. Now there were only two great powers left: the United States of America, which at the end of the war had an intact economy, an intact army, and a virtual monopoly on the manufacture and employment of the nuclear weapons. Okay. The other great power left standing but scared by Nazi onslaught was the Soviet Union, which had a large and intact army and was in the control of almost half of the European continent. The final demise of the European great power system led to the development of bipolar world dominated by the flank powers, the USA and the USSR. The bipolar configuration of the international system was marked for the next 50 years by the Cold War, a political and ideological rivalry on global scale between the US and Soviet Union. The another immediate consequence of the war was the end of colonialism. After the war, Britain and France were confronted with various domestic and external problems. Both of them could no longer hold on to their respective colonies. Thus, the post-World War witnessed the end of colonialism in Africa and Asia. With the end of the war and the demise of European great power system, the process of decolonization occurred. The defeated powers which had overseas colonies or conquered overseas territories were forced by the Allies to surrender them. This was the case for Italy and Japan. France and Great Britain, the great European colonizing nations, were gradually forced to give up their empires due to cost of maintaining colonies, the relative weakness of the metropolises in the international system, the development of violent and or peaceful national liberation movements, and foreign pressures coming from the US and USSR or from former colonies which supported the process of decolonization. Dear students, now let me talk about the another important consequences, which is the creation of the UNO. Another consequence of the World War II was a renewed and somewhat misplaced trust in international institutions as a means to manage international politics. Subsequently, the Allies created the United Nations Organization, an organization for the international cooperation and diplomacy, similar to the League of Nations. Even though the UN did not achieve its objectives of preventing conflict, the United Nations provided the necessary framework and the arena to discuss and debate some of the issues of the international system. New international economic order, which is another important consequence of the World War II. Bretton Woods Conference, formerly the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, meeting at Bretton Woods during the World War II to make financial arrangements for the post-World War after the expected defeat of Germany and Japan. It drew up a project for the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, now known as World Bank, to make long-term capital available to states urgently needing such foreign aid, and a project for the International Monetary Fund to finance short-term imbalances in international payments to stabilize exchange rates. Also, the US dollar was established as a reserve currency for world trade. To conclude, it was comprehended that the reverberations of the World War II, the most devastating conflict in human history, are still felt in modern world. Spanning 6 long and bloody years, the war was fought across thousands of kilometers of land, sea and air, pitting Poles against Germany, Italians against Americans, and Japanese against Australians. Ultimately, it was resolved with the use of nuclear weapons, leaving more than 80 million dead and much of Europe and Asia in ruins. The war had a profound impact on the political and social landscape of the world. The United Nations was established to promote international cooperation and prevent future conflicts, and the 5 victorious great powers, the USA, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and France, became permanent members of the Security Council. This set the stage for the Cold War, a 46-year period of rivalry between the two superpowers. Meanwhile, the influence of European great powers waned and the decolonization of Asia and Africa began. Most countries whose industries had been damaged during the war began to recover economically. Political integration, particularly in Europe, was seen as a way to bridge the divide between former enemies and create a unified identity. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture. Hope you have understood it. See you next time with a new topic. Till then, take care and goodbye.